Und jetzt freuen wir uns sehr, sehr, dass Melinda heute hier bei uns ist, den weiten Weg über den großen Teich angetreten hat. Und genau, Melinda, du hast das Wort. Schön, dass du da bist.
It's an honor to be here with you today, and especially to be in the presence of such strategic and committed activists. You're really in the midst of a truly historic campaign, and it's a thrill to be here with you. I have an immense amount to learn from you. Just last night, hearing from the local activists and all of your creative actions, it was truly inspiring. I've learned a lot. I'm excited to take that back with me to the United States. I was invited here this morning to share with you some views about the TTIP and the so-called free trade agenda from the other side of the Atlantic. And I think the information and the update I have to share with you are kind of three parts. The first is a stark warning about the seriousness of what's at stake. And second, an expression of gratitude for your activism. And third, a message of solidarity from the United States. But first, the warning. First, the warning. Your concerns about the potential negative consequences and impacts of a corporate-dominated free trade agreement with the United States are well-founded. I know that the European Commission and supporters of TTIP frequently say that there's no way standards will be lowered through TTIP, that the critics are worried for nothing. Well, in the United States, we unfortunately have more than 20 years of lived experience with the results of the types of secretive trade agreements that have been dominated by corporate interests. And I say this because in the early 1990s, big multinational corporations, more corporate interests, pushed the closed-door negotiations that led to the North America Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Proponents of NAFTA promised wonderful things, just as proponents of TTIP have been promising wonderful things. We were promised that NAFTA would generate hundreds of thousands of jobs. But after 10 years, in just the first 10 years, 1 million jobs were lost. In the area of NAFTA and similar policies, 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs in the United States, 5 million were offshored from the United States. That didn't just affect the people who lost those jobs, but it led to an overall depression of wages and an increase in income inequality because the jobs that were replaced were low-wage service sector jobs, and it undermined the bargaining power of labor when there's a threat that jobs can be offshored. But incredibly, perhaps, NAFTA did not just hurt working people in the United States. It's not that Mexico and Canada benefited in terms of the working people. In Mexico, we were promised that it would raise the standard of living in Mexico. Well, in fact, subsidized corn dumped in Mexico displaced 2 million farmers, and desperate people, the immigration from Mexico doubled in the years after NAFTA. So the promises that were made not only didn't come to fruition, but what we saw was the opposite. And unfortunately, the same flawed process, secretive process in the United States, this is dominated by official trade advisors. There are between 500 and 600 of them at any given time. 90% of them represent big US business and trade associations. And they have access to the texts. They are helping to influence what the rules are while the public is locked out. And we're seeing that same process first with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, that the United States is negotiated with Pacific Rim countries, and of course the TTIP. The TPP negotiations were concluded last fall, after 7 years of intense and very secretive negotiations. And while we were very worried from what we had seen from leaks and what we had heard from talking to negotiators over the years, we now have seen the actual final text of the TPP, and it's far worse than we feared. They claimed that they were going to fix Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. But in fact, they simply replicated, often word for word, mostly word for word, the same model of ISDS that has led to attacks on public health, environmental regulations, toxics bans, and it's even expanded the danger of ISDS for the first time, giving foreign banks the opportunity to use one of the provisions that's been most successful in getting taxpayer compensation. Now foreign banks for the first time can use that, that provision in ISDS. And it more than doubled, it would more than double the US's exposure to ISDS. There's novel language in the TPP on biotechnology that goes further than any previous trade agreement in pushing the agenda of big biotech and agribusiness in the United States to be able to attack countries' GMO policies. It prohibits localization of data with serious implications for data privacy and has very, very weak exceptions. It catered to a wish list of brand name pharmaceutical companies to expand their monopolies in many countries, and under the guise of so-called transparency, be able to influence and challenge government purchasing and negotiations of medical devices and medicines to increase big pharmaceutical companies' profits at the expense of access to medicines for patients. And I'm telling you about the TPP now because it's clear that US companies and the US trade representative do not intend to get less in TTIP than they got in the TPP. They want these agreements to be coherent, as they say. And shockingly, what we've seen in the past couple of months in the United States and Washington since the conclusion of the TPP negotiations should make us all even more worried than we were before. And I say that because the corporate lobby in the US was not satisfied with the 98 or 99% of what they wanted in the TPP. For example, the only public interest gain on ISDS and TPP was a small carve-out for tobacco control measures. So Philip Morris couldn't sue the way they did in Australia. That was the only thing. Well, now the Senate Majority Leader in the United States, because he is beholden to the tobacco companies, is holding up the TPP, even though he loves the TPP. He's holding up the TPP because they want more. The pharmaceutical industry and Wall Street firms are holding up support and demanding more concessions from TPP countries, even though the negotiations are over, because they didn't get 100% of what they wanted, even though the TPP furthers their interests probably more than any other trade agreement from before. So when the European Commission says, don't worry, there's no way we're going to accept chlorinated chicken, there's no way there'll be hormones in beef, or don't worry, regulatory cooperation is voluntary, it won't result in the lowering of standards in the future, you're right to continue to worry. Either the EU will have to concede to US corporate interests on many of these areas, or it's hard to imagine that they will allow a deal to conclude at all. So, as US civil society, we are worried about the lowering of European standards too in the areas of food and chemical safety and climate policy, because we're trying to improve in those areas. But we're also worried about our fragile efforts to re-regulate the financial sector and Wall Street. We are worried that that could be undermined by European banks who have been very clear that they are unhappy with some of the stronger financial regulations that we have in the United States. And people in the US are also very worried about the very offensive way that the European Union is trying to undermine our buy local policies, procurement policies that allow our federal, state, and local governments to reinvest tax dollars locally to support local jobs in the context of a recovery. Those are very popular policies in the United States. And by the way, they didn't give any of that away in TPP. So that is not really even on the table. The threat of ISDS just became even more real for us in the United States last month. You may have heard that TransCanada which is the Canadian company that was going to build the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada through the United States to transport the dirtiest of fossil fuels, tar sands. They just filed a NAFTA ISDS suit for $15 billion against the United States when we finally had a historic environmental victory to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. When President Obama in November said, we will not build the pipeline, it was a historic victory, and now that and other movements to keep carbon in the ground are being threatened by ISDS cases. So anyway, that's the bad news. And that is the warning that I wanted to bring. So much is at stake. We cannot let these new generation of trade agreements, TPP, TTIP, CETA, TISA, bankrupt our future. We cannot allow that to happen. But that brings me to my next point. We in the United States are so grateful for you, for your impressive campaigning against the TTIP in Germany. We were so inspired by the images of 250,000 people marching in the streets of Berlin last October, of your ability to educate the public, to move your policymakers, your judges, to respond to the critiques and concerns that you have built and you have raised. Given the level of corporate capture, unfortunately, of the United States USTR, they have been unwilling to even increase transparency to the level of what the European Commission is doing in the negotiations, despite intense pressure, not just from civil society, but from members of Congress and from academics and more. We know we cannot stop this corporate damaging agenda on our own in the United States. In many ways, the German campaign and the other strong campaigns across Europe are what give us hope to be able to stop this extreme corporate agenda of TTIP. So we're counting on you, on your strategic and savvy and the plans that you're going to be building in the next and these 2 days to build your campaign even stronger. And we want to be able to support you in your efforts in any way that we can. My last and related message is that the U.S. civil society stands in solidarity with your campaigns against corporate-dominated trade agreements. In the U.S., we are currently, our focus has been, over the past couple of years, to build opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP that I spoke about, due to its urgency. But many of the same issues that animate that debate about undermining democracy, ISDS, food safety, medicine prices are similar to what you are talking about here. I'll have the opportunity to share more about that, about the specifics of the U.S. campaign in the afternoon, but I'll say here that our campaign is unprecedented in its breadth and scope. And while we were unsuccessful ultimately in stopping fast-track trade authority last summer, which would have been the death knell for TPP and TTIP, the long delay and the bloody political battle that was waged and the anger that people feel for the way that it was forced through and strong-armed in the end has meant that we managed to make trade policy one of the biggest hot political issues now in the context of the U.S. presidential and congressional elections in 2016. That strengthens our ability to drag these secretive trade agreements into the spotlight. And now all the top candidates on the Republicans and Democratic side have been forced to say that they are opposing this corporate trade agenda through the TPP, and we will push them further around TTIP. And in Brussels, I was just in Brussels a couple of days ago for the round of negotiations, and I found it interesting that the chief negotiators, they really sounded quite defensive. They reiterated their goal. We are going to conclude in 2016. There will not be a TTIP light. We will make sure that we are able to do it. They felt it came across as very defensive. It came across very clearly that they're not moving quickly. They are feeling the pressure on both sides of the Atlantic. So we are gearing up We're gearing up for an intense year of campaigning in the United States. I know you are too. We will look forward to continue to build transatlantic cooperation to defeat this corporate trade agenda so that we can come together sometime soon, I hope not in the too distant future, and celebrate our transatlantic victory and begin to build a different vision for cooperation that puts people and the planet, not corporate interests, at the center of our cooperation. So I wish you a very, very successful strategy meeting this afternoon, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.